Welcome to Time Travel Sunday. We're in Berlin, 1936. We're at the Summer Olympics. And we're watching Jesse Owens win 4 gold medals. Americans were overjoyed. When he got back to the United States, they threw a ticker tape parade for him through the streets of Manhattan. After the ticker tape parade, they had a reception in his honor at the Waldorf Astoria. He had to take the freight elevator up to the reception. So the theme of today's message is proving ourselves. Jesse Owens proved himself on the world stage in the 1936 Olympics. He proved himself enough to where they threw a ticker tape parade for him. But he didn't prove himself enough to where a white guest at the Waldorf Astoria would feel comfortable sharing an elevator with a black man. So what was going on in 1936 when Jesse Owens was winning the gold medals? Well, in South Carolina, there was an 8th grader named Larry Doby. And he finished his 8th grade year, and his mom moved him to Paterson, New Jersey, so he could go to an integrated high school. Larry Doby went to Eastside High School in Paterson, and he would become a great 4-sport athlete. When he was at Eastwood, there was an author named Luke Eplin who wrote a book called Our Time. And Eplin said that at Eastside there were about 300 students in Larry Doby's class, and there were a handful who were African American. Larry Doby was friends with everybody. They would go to parties, they would go to dances, they would go to movies. And it was interesting when they go to the movies because they'd walk into the theater and Larry Doby would do what he was supposed to. He'd walk up to the balcony where the African American kids sat, and the rest of his friends would go into the lower part of the theater. They'd watch the movie, they'd finish the movie, they'd meet in the lobby, and they'd go about their day. It was like normal. They were all friends, they all got along, and they all just did what they were supposed to do. And it made me think that racism isn't something we're born with. It's something we learn just through whatever customs we're growing up with at that time. Larry Doby loved being a student athlete, he loved his friends, and he thrived in the camaraderie. Now, when he wasn't with his friends, he was alone a lot. His mother, her name was Etta, was a live-in domestic maid. She was working all the time. And Larry said that on Thursdays and Saturdays, she would take the bus, she'd visit him, and they'd meet, and they'd have a good time. And then Larry had a high school sweetheart named Helen, who he ended up by marrying and spending the rest of his life with. Now, in his senior year, his Eastside High School team won the state championship in football. They had never won it before, and it was fantastic. And Larry was so popular in the school that they actually threw a testimonial dinner for him in February of 1942. And he had a high school teammate. The high school quarterback's name was Al Kachorian. And Kachorian said that Larry Doby was just fantastic. In baseball, he'd go out and he'd get like 4 hits in a row and he'd just dominate. And then after the game, we'd all go home and say, he's fantastic. It's too bad he's black. He should be playing in the major leagues. We actually felt sorry for him. So Larry Doby proved himself. He was a four-sport letterman at Eastwood High. He proved himself enough for the town to throw a testimonial dinner for him, but he didn't prove himself worthy of taking a shot at being a Major League Baseball player. So he graduates, and he accepts a basketball scholarship at Long Island University. And then he also played for a professional team called the Newark Eagles, Newark, New Jersey Eagles, and they were in the Negro National League. Now, the Negro Leagues is where African Americans played professional baseball when they were excluded from the major leagues. In 1943, he was drafted into the Navy, and after he was drafted, he got on a train, and the train went from Penn Station in Newark to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center outside of Chicago. He felt good on the train. The train was filled with a diverse group of kids, and a lot of the kids were the kids he knew, the kids he grew up with, and he thought, you know, the country's in war right now, and it seems like we're all in this together. That comfort was shattered when they got to the naval station, because when they got off the bus, the military people just separated the black kids from the white kids, and the black kids were given the menial jobs of cooking, cleaning, and shining shoes. Luke Epplin wrote that the naval base had a baseball team called the Blue Jackets, but it was a white-only team, so Larry Doby was ineligible. But for some reason, there was a basketball team he could play on. And then after a period of time, they formed a black baseball team, and they formed a black all-star team. So he got to play baseball, and there was one time where they competed against the white team. And Doby walked away from that really frustrated. He said, I know there were several black players that could have cracked the lineup in that white team, but we never got a tryout. He said, this is a crying shame. When I'm here to protect my country, I couldn't do anything about it. I was under Navy rules and regulations, and I had to abide by those rules or face the consequences. So after Illinois, Larry Doby was transferred to Treasure Island. And then he went to Utah and San Diego. And in 1945, he was stationed in Ulithi, which is a volcanic atoll in the Carolina Islands between Guam and the Philippines. It was a staging area as the Allies were working to secure the Philippines, and they were actually preparing for a possible invasion of Japan. Then October 1945 comes. The war is over, and Larry Doby is still overseas. And one night he's just hanging out in the recreation center, and a sailor comes running in, and he's euphoric. He says, the Dodgers just signed Jackie Robinson. And Larry Doby said, well, that's it for me. No more going back to school. Baseball is going to be my way forward. So Jackie Robinson was the first. And he had proven himself. He proved himself at UCLA as a four-sport athlete. And then he proved himself in the United States Army as a second lieutenant. Just like Larry Doby had proven himself as a four-sport athlete in Patterson and as serving his country in the United States Navy. But in 1945, a black athlete, black baseball player needed one more thing. They needed the baseball executive who was going to take the risk of breaking the 60-year-old color barrier. For Jackie Robinson, that was Branch Rickey. For Larry Doby, it was a man named Bill Veeck. Now, who is Bill Veeck? Bill Veeck was also a World War II veteran. He lost part of his leg through complications. An artillery unit hit his leg, and he was born in a baseball family. His dad was an executive from the Chicago Cubs. And his dad was a real button-down guy, always wore a coat and tie and a hat. And Bill was the opposite. He was the quintessential person, you would say, thinking outside the box. In fact, he wrote a book. He wrote an autobiography, and the title of the book was Veeck, as in wreck. So he had a sense of humor. He didn't take himself too seriously. But he worked for the Cubs when his dad was working for the Cubs. And then his dad died young. He was probably in his 40s, and Bill Veeck was 19. And he left the Cubs, and he bought a minor league team. He bought the Milwaukee Brewers. And he was very, very interested in the fan experience. He would go so far as before the game, he would greet the fans before the game. He'd walk in the ballpark and you'd see the team owner. And then he'd sit amongst the fans during the game. He'd ask them questions, he'd get feedback. And then after the game, he might even wish them well when they left the ballpark. He had absolutely no interest in the separation of the races. So now it's 1942. And with World War II going on, there's a real shortage of Major League Baseball players because they're all overseas. In fact, some of the greatest players that are in the Hall of Fame, they were gone for 3 or 4 years. Some even landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. Well, the owners went so far, the Cincinnati Reds actually brought in a 15-year-old high school kid to play in the major leagues. His name was Joe Nuxall. So Veeck gets this idea. The Philadelphia Phillies are hapless. They're not a very good team. So I'm going to buy the Phillies, and I'm going to just stock them up with Negro League ball players. They're going to be a good team, and it's going to integrate baseball. Well, the commissioner of baseball's name was Kennesaw Mountain Landis, and he shut down the whole idea, and Veeck could not get away from it. So he stayed with the Brewers, and in 1942, he was at spring training with his team in Ocala, Florida. And columnist Anthony Castrovintz wrote about an incident where Bill Veeck, the owner of the team, went into the colored section of the ballpark in Florida. And he's just doing what he does. He's chatting up the fans, and they're having a good time. Well, security comes down. You're going to have to leave. This is the colored section, and you're not allowed in here. And Veeck said, no. And he said, well, you're really going to have to leave. It's law. It got so bad, the mayor drove over to the stadium and said, please, you've got to respect our segregation laws. And Veeck just simply said, if this keeps up, I'm pulling my team out of here on the spot. We're done. And that's just the way he was. He said, what offends me about prejudice is it assumes unwarranted superiority. And coming in 1948, that's a bold statement. It assumes unwarranted superiority. So Mike Veeck is Bill Veeck's son, and he was part of a Netflix documentary, and he tells a story. He says Veeck was working with his father when he was young, when his father was with the Cubs. And one day, they're in the office, and Dad brought in the money that they brought in during the game. And he said to his son, Bill, what color is this money? And Bill said, it's green. And then he said, all right, so what color is the man who put the money in the till? And Bill thought for a minute. He says, I don't know. And his dad said, exactly. And that stayed with him for his whole life. Now, as he was thinking about integrating baseball, and by this time he owned the Cleveland Indians, he knew how to prepare. And he put a lot of time in it, just like Branch Rickey put a lot of time into preparing to bring Jackie Robinson in. And he hired a scout named Bill Kiefer, formerly a player in the Negro Leagues, and he would just scout players. And he hired a black promoter named Lewis Jones. Lewis Jones is the first black executive in Major League Baseball, and he was somebody that Bill Veeck hired. And his task was to prepare the city leaders for desegregation of baseball. Now, this is where it gets complicated, and this is where, no matter how progressive somebody is, and Bill Veeck was progressive in this, Branch Rickey was progressive with this, but the ideas were still backward. And their biggest fear was not that Larry Doby wasn't going to work out, or not that Jackie Robinson wasn't going to work out. The biggest fear was the black community was going to mess things up. They were going to be so excited that there were African Americans playing the major leagues, they'd go to the ballpark and carry on, and they'd make the white fans feel uncomfortable. So it's like 60 years, African Americans have been systematically kept out of the major leagues. And if it's going to work out, you people that have been oppressed are going to have to make it work out. We're going to do the best we can, but you're going to have to make it work out. So in February of 1947, this is going back to Branch Rickey, he told an audience of black civic leaders, the biggest threat to success, the one enemy most likely to ruin that success, is the Negro people themselves. Veeck encouraged the leaders to preach a message of self-policing to the black fans who attend the game. Veeck also believed that Brooklyn's history of multicultural accommodation see far more better setting than Cleveland for the integrated process to unfold. So that's one of the things they had to get through. But that said, July 5th, 1947, Larry Doby joins the Cleveland Indians. So what was his first day on the job like? Well, he gets there, and Bill Veeck walks up to him and he says, "Hello, Lawrence." And Larry Doby said, "Hello, Mr. Veeck." And Mr. Veeck said, "Call me Bill." That just stunned Larry Doby. In his whole life and all of his experiences, no employer ever said to him or any other African American employee he had ever heard of, "Call me by my first name." It was always Mr., Mrs., or Miss. So they go about the day, and the manager of the Cleveland Indians' name is Lou Boudreau. And what he does is he lines the whole team up. And he says, "I'd like to introduce our newest ball player. This is Larry Doby." And he got the full gamut. He had about 4 or 5 guys that gave a real firm handshake. He had a couple guys that was like, not so sure. And then he had a few that kept their hands to the side. But he made the rounds, walked past each one of them, and then went on about the day. A story that's not talked about is where Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby came from where they played baseball before they got to the Dodgers and the Indians. Jackie Robinson played for the Kansas City Monarchs in the Negro American League. And Branch Rickey just said, all right, you just come to work with us. And he didn't compensate the Kansas City Monarchs at all. It was like, that's the untold story, was Negro League teams were thriving businesses, and they just basically went out of business when Major League Baseball integrated. Well, with Larry Doby and Bill Veeck gave Effa Manley, who was the owner of the Newark Eagles, $15,000 when he hired Larry Doby away, and another $5,000 when he stayed with the Cleveland Indians for 30 days. And that's something when Luke Eplin, the author of Our Town, talked with Larry Doby Jr., that Larry Doby Jr. is really proud of, that Bill Veeck really respected the Negro Leagues. And it's not lost on Bill Veeck's, or Larry Doby's son. So now they're going about the business of baseball, and there's a lot of ups and downs. And there were a lot of nights where Larry Doby would call Jackie Robinson up, and they'd talk on the phone for hours, and they'd talk about the slurs they're hearing, they'd talk about everything they're going through. And Doby noted, I got the same slurs as he did, but he was the first, so he's the one everybody talked about. But it's not like when I came in, they said, all right, he's the second black, we're going to be nice to him. But he said those candid conversations that Doby had with Robinson kept each other from giving up. They were really important. And in those ups and downs, the biggest up was in 1948, Larry Doby's second year with the Cleveland Indians, they won the World Series. And in order to get to the World Series, they had to win a game in Boston against the Red Sox. And they won that game, and the team had the wildest party you could ever imagine when they celebrated. They were at the Dunmere Hotel, and they're just eating, drinking, dancing, and they're doing everything you'd expect a ball team to do after they win a championship. And they're looking around, and they don't see Larry Doby. They don't see their other African-American teammate, Satchel Paige, who was later acquired by the Cleveland Indians. And they go looking for him, and they're both in their rooms. And they actually, Larry Doby and Satchel Paige did not know if they'd be welcome at the party. So the players just said, you guys get down here, you're part of the team, and enjoy the festivities. So then the World Series comes. And in one of the games, in Game 4, Larry Doby hit a home run. And it was a big home run that helped win the game. And this is Larry Doby and Steve Gromick. Now, if you've watched any sports, if you've seen a version of this photo once, you've seen it 100 times. You probably saw something like this last week after the Eagles won the Super Bowl. Two players just euphoric over winning a championship. Joe Montana, Jerry Rice. This is the first time anybody had ever seen a black man and a white man embrace. And it was stunning. Steve Gromick, the pitcher, who benefited from the big home run, tells a story that he went back to his hometown after the season was over, went to his neighborhood bar. Somebody he had known for 10 years, played ball with, was in the bar. And he said, hey, how you doing? Guy didn't respond, nothing. Hey, how you doing? Nothing. The bartender said, he's sore about that picture you took with Doby. Why couldn't you just shake his hand? And then another one of his friends said, you know what? If I was Steve, I would have done the same thing. If Doby got a hit like that, I would have actually kissed him. But that was what was happening in 1948. So Larry Doby proved himself. He played 13 years in the major leagues. The Indians went back to the World Series in 1954. Doby retired from baseball in 1959, managed the Chicago White Sox in 1978, and was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1998, before he passed away in 2003. So what does it mean? What does it all mean for African Americans proving themselves? Malcolm X believed that black people had already proven themselves. They proved themselves through their resilience, their contributions, and their survival despite systemic racism. He saw no reason why African Americans should even try to prove themselves anymore. Dr. Martin Luther King often spoke about the struggle Africans have faced in proving their worth in a society that systemically denied them opportunities. He rejected the idea that black people needed to prove themselves to be treated as equal. Dr. King emphasized that instead of that, their humanity and rights were inherent not on something they earned, but just that they were children of God. So let us pray. Heavenly Father, fill our hearts with wisdom and grace that we may let go of the burden of proving ourselves to others and the expectation that others must prove themselves to us. Remind us that our worth is already established in your love. Help us rest in the peace of knowing that we are enough just as you created us. Amen.